they're fast-moving cost reduction curves because of the cleanliness of the power, and because we're already seeing dramatic adoption and movement in the solar side. So we at RMI knew we couldn't do this alone, and so we teamed up with a couple key partners here, Homer Energy, and you'll hear more from both Peter and John here in a minute, but they have one of the most sophisticated tools out there for modeling microgrids and thinking about the operational as well as the economics of the types of systems. Cone Rennick Think Energy was a key partner who had really tremendous access to actual deal data and the economics behind decision making. And then RMI brought our 30 years of experience in the clean energy and energy efficiency space. The board itself really came up with three key important messages from our analytics. First, that favorable defection economics exist for just a small minority of customers today, primarily in very high-priced regions like Hawaii, but will expand to millions of customers by 2024 under a very conservative set of assumptions. Again, those markets that are going to be most susceptible to favorable economics will be in either high-priced regions on the west or the northeast, where we've got reasonable insulation levels or favorable economics. The second observation from our analysis was that a combination of either technological advance or focusing on reducing the amount of demand for energy at the customer side, which in smaller systems and smaller capital investments to begin with, can result in pulling forward that parity economics by 5 to 10 years versus those base assumptions that we have. And then, the third observation that we had was really that defection is suboptimal, that in essence, for any individual to disconnect from the grid for either their business or their home, they have to invest a lot of extra capital to manage that last 2% of their demand that peaks at different times, and that in some ways having a portfolio benefit of pooling community resources is a much more effective way to go. And these three conclusions from our analytics led to three implications that we kind of noted, specifically that the traditional utility business model is broken today, since the regulatory recovery process for assets that are being invested in may not hold up. In effect, utilities are making investments in hopes of recovering across customers that may not exist in the future. Secondly, we saw very clearly that there are points at which, in the not-too-distant future, these hybrid systems become cheaper than the other forms of generating and managing operational performance of the grid. And for that reason, they can and should be able to create value for the customer, for the utility, and for developers alike if we can find ways to share in that value creation through new business models. And thirdly, that those new business models really need to be structured in a way that allow for the exchange of value between consumers and generators, where that role may shift on a fairly fluid basis depending on time of day, time of week, time of year, and we need to start preparing and thinking for systems that are resilient in that type of dynamic. So those were the key findings. Let me just go through some of the analytical underpinnings so you understand how we derive these. We had an analytical approach that specifically looked at cost trajectories for things like solar and cost reduction, batteries, inverters. We did also look at fuel prices. In some of our analysis, we looked at the ability to supplement, in particular on the commercial side, specific hybrid performance with a backup diesel generator. We looked at both residential and commercial load profiles, two average load profiles that we shifted to different parts of the country. And then we really, from a financial perspective, modeled the capital and operating costs for each of those systems and included just two financial incentives, the ITC and its current trajectory and decline in 2017, as well as accelerated depreciation concerns. And based on that, we use the Homer model essentially to produce the energy cost and operational performance characteristics that helped inform our report results. So we did, as I mentioned, look at 5 different areas of the country, and this was very important as we thought about the dynamics of power pricing and insulation levels. It was important for us to get a cross-section of different areas to understand just how the dynamics of the kind of emergence of these particular technologies could unfold. And so we ranged from looking at the New York area, where we've got high prices today and escalating into the future, Louisville, Kentucky, which is one of the cheapest areas for power production today, San Antonio, Texas, which is also, again, very deep today but has good insulation levels, Los Angeles, California, which obviously is higher priced and excellent insulation, and then Honolulu, which is the highest priced market in the country today. We modeled 4 cases, and specifically we had a base case that's basically a fairly conservative look at PV and battery cost reduction today in the moving down to the range of kind of $1.50 per watt installed for commercial and as high as $2.75 for residential, just to give you rough markers there. We then had an accelerated technology case, which said, well, what if we were to hit the Department of Energy goals for both solar and storage? And those are on the 125 per watt peak on the commercial side. They're a battery goal of $1 or $125 per kilowatt hour as being kind of the relative level. So that was second case. Third case was saying, well, what if we kept our current cost trajectories, but instead we optimized the load, and we used some Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory data and studies, along with some other studies to allow us to look at a case where essentially about a third of the energy required was reduced up front before installing these systems to optimize the amount of capital required. And finally, we looked at a case where we combined both the accelerated technology development alongside a business model that promoted capture of energy efficiency before installing the system to create truly an optimized install, and we called that our combined improvement case. So, that analysis through our data on page 11, what you see here are the results for our 5 different geographies across our 4 cases. And the different colors here represent each of the different geographies, with Hawaii, for instance, being blue and Westchester, New York being yellow. And then with alongside each of these lines, you'll see a small set of letters there that indicate the case, where CI is the combined improvement case, BC is the base case, etc. And looking at this evolution of data, what you see is that over the next 10 years, the blue lines, Hawaii in particular, sees grid parity, or the economic competitiveness of these hybrid systems relative to the base rates of the utilities at virtually today at parity, or in the very near future. That over that time frame, Westchester, New York, also across all 4 cases, sees parity, and that Los Angeles, California, in all but the base case, reach parity. So we see kind of the rapid adoption, or not the adoption, but the rapid parity rise. Adoption is a very different story, but we would argue that the economics, in some ways, can infer the start of adoption by where it's cost competitive. Residential side, you'll see, again, same nomenclature here with divisions of colors and labels, that Hawaii, again, a little bit further off for residential parity, but still within the next 10 years, and that Los Angeles, California, again, in 3 of the 4 cases, we reach parity over the next 10 years. and starting to happen as well in the most aggressive cases in New York State. Now, the interesting thing is this analysis was based on just the costs and an average profile within a region. If, however, we stratify the regions and look at the different levels of rates across the region, and here you see the division of the 10 deciles in the southwestern United States, including the states of Arizona, California, Colorado, New Mexico, Nevada, and Utah. You see in our base case about 2% of customers in that region actually see favorable rates. If we, however, move to just demand-side improvement, about 50% have reached that economic parity point. In our accelerated technology case, you get up to about the 70% level, again, for commercial in this region. And then in our combined improvement scenario, so if a business model is built that allows the capture of efficiency alongside the deployment of much cheaper technology, we get to that combined improvement case and 100% of the customers at risk for economic defection. With the residential story, it's actually not nearly so favorable, but we do see, as in the base case, well above, and you would expect minimal adoption. In the demand-side improvement case, coming much closer to parity for the highest cost residential customers, similarly for the accelerated technology deployment. And then finally, the combined improvement case, you get up to the 70 to 80% range as being economic. Back and provide the key messages again from this analysis. First is that favorable defection economics still exist for millions of customers in a decade. And as I mentioned, just because those economics exist, it's not implied defection will happen. But the fact is that it does start to put them in an at-risk position for grid. Secondly, would say as well that defection is suboptimal. It's suboptimal because of the fact that we wind up over-investing in these systems and we have capital that's not being used as effectively as possible, but also there are equity issues around the fact that those who aren't able to afford or who don't have the proper operational configuration to support these systems would be left carrying an increasing cost for the grid. Third, we would say that the traditional utility business model is broken today and needs repair because we simply can't expect that costs will be able to be recovered across customers that possibly defect in the future. And then finally, there's value in these hybrid systems. Any point at which you see the economics flip and parity is achieved, then we can start thinking of these as potential resources to provide additional value to the grid. We can construct the business models to harness those. So that's a quick overview, Dan, of the study results, and I'll pass it back to you.
Well, thank you very much, John. To turn things over to Peter Lilienthal now of Homer Energy. Before I do, I just wanted to mention a quick reminder that if you have a question for John or any of our panelists, type it into the chat box there on the right, and we will queue it up for their response over the conference bridge during the Q&A period. So now, like I said, I'd like to welcome our next panelist, Dr. Peter Lilienthal of Homer Energy, who will offer Homer's perspective on the report and how its findings are reached. Peter?
Thank you, Dan. Thank you, John, for that excellent overview of the report itself. As John described, the analytic results report were generated by the Homer software. So I want to talk a little bit about it. The development of the Homer software began at the National Renewable Energy Lab over 20 years ago. And then it was converted to a Windows application and made available over the web. It has since taken off with over 107,000 users in 193 countries, mostly outside the lower 48. 2009, we spun off Homer Energy as a private company with the exclusive license. The Homer has become an industry standard for modeling all types of distributed power systems and microgrids. These grids can be connected to a larger grid, or they can be isolated or islanded. Typically hybrid systems, and there's ways to combine the various renewable resources with conventional generation and a variety of new storage and load management technologies. All new technology is great, but it's an analytic challenge and confronts decision makers with too many choices. Someone wants to know what is best or what makes the most sense where. The answer is that it depends. It depends on site-specific resources and energy requirements. The technology keeps improving, so cost and performance are a moving target. Homer's goal is to fit these pieces together because a confused mind says no. All these choices requires more than just a spreadsheet. Homer software is a powerful chronological simulation tool in the decision analysis framework. Recent loads vary over time, so Homer models an entire year, hour by hour, or minute by minute. This is the cost for a particular system. The optimization layer then performs those simulations for hundreds or thousands of different system configurations and ranks them by net present cost, by the least cost system for a particular scenario. Activity analysis shows how the optimal solution and other results change if fuel prices change or technology improves or anything is different from your assumptions. We perform a sensitivity analysis by varying the wind speed, which is on the x-axis, and the fuel price, which is on the y-axis. Renewables are not cost-effective in the black area where the fuel price and wind speed are both low. Above about 62 cents per liter, PV becomes cost-effective in the red area. Wind speeds in the blue area, wind is cost-effective, and in the green area, a hybrid of wind and solar is the least cost option. In analysis, we were able to show that adding wind would significantly decrease both the fuel consumption on the x-axis and the total cost, including the capital cost of the wind, on the y-axis. It shows where is the point of diminishing returns for adding more storage. The thickness of the side of this curve is a very characteristic result. It gets harder and harder to eliminate the last few percent of conventional energy. This similar cost function in terms of carbon emissions on the x-axis. I believe policy debate could be much less polarized if it focused more on the middle of this graph than the end points. Because of the chronological simulation, you can see how a system would actually operate on an hour-by-hour basis, or minute for that matter, for 2 days in July. The lines show that the first day is cloudy, the second day is mostly sunny. Lines show when the backup generator is needed, and the light blue lines show when the battery is charged or discharged. So for this report, our analysis tells us that storage is the critical technology for economical grid defection. So then further improvements in PV technology. But storage alone aren't quite enough. For the case, we assumed a very small but important usage of a backup generator. For the residential case, we assumed the homeowner could aggressively manage their loads, for example, only doing laundry on sunny days. Not every home is a candidate. Depending on factors such as the size of the neighborhood trees or whether they live in a multi-family building, some homeowners simply will not be able to self-keep fairly. Look specifically at combined heat and power. There may be an even better candidate for grid defection. Systems are more complex than simple rooftop solar, so they need support contracts for regular maintenance. What became very clear is that there is a win-win opportunity with PV and storage. Another time, defection is the best term for it. But if it has a system that allows them to stay on their own when there's any kind of problem with the grid, then they get increased reliability and utility gets increased flexibility. And that flexibility will become more and more valuable as more and more renewables enter the system. Systems that the utility can communicate to the user and compensate the user for providing that flexibility, whether in a peak period or other potential outage. Where unsubsidized renewables begins to make fundamental economic sense. Right now, that is mostly in places reliant on diesel fuel, such as Hawaii, Alaska, tens of thousands of other inhabited islands and remote areas, and in developing countries with unreliable grids. Fundamentals exist, though. These places go to high penetrations of renewable power very quickly. It requires a rethinking of the entire structure of the utility system. The penetrations are what we call smart, clean microgrids. These are systems that are capable of standing on their own and managing their own variability. They sell power from the grid only when it makes economic sense to both the customer and the utility company. Their own customized level of reliability and renewables, and it solves the problem that utility companies worry about, such as voltage and frequency stability, minimum loading, reverse power flows, ramp rates. Although their widespread adoption will require substantial regulatory reforms, microgrids are projected to be a $40 billion market by 2020. This view of the evolution of utility grids. Interconnected utilities have daunting security and regulatory obstacles to quit implementing the smart grid technologies that will make high penetration renewables viable. Other systems are showing the way. These grids can also be connected to a larger grid. Most of the focus to date on grid-connected microgrids has been large systems for military bases or university campuses. Smaller package systems will make the same capability available to individual buildings. We think that this can be a win-win for both utility and its customers. And John Glassmeyer from Homer Energy will go a little more detail about how we used Homer and how you can take our analysis to the next step. Dan.
Thanks, Peter. Finally, I would like to turn it over to John Glassmeyer, also of Homer, who will walk us through the Homer software in a little more detail and how it was used in some of the report's numbers. A quick reminder, if you have a question for any of the panelists, please type it into the chat box there on the right, and we'll queue it up for response during the Q&A period. John Glassmeyer, go ahead.
And thank you, Peter and John Kreitz, for that background report. So the things that we'd like to do as an extension of this report is to help some readers build off of our analysis. So we have basically opened up our models on our Homer community forum. See the URL, and you can there download the 40 Homer models that we used for our report. You can also find a primer with some help on how you can use the models yourself. I encourage you to modify these models and engage in active discussion in our user group community forum. To merit interesting further study, you could, for example, look at what would happen in the commercial case if you replaced the diesel generator that we modeled with a natural gas fuel cell. Or you could apply the levels of grid independence for the residential case, or you could try different geography. We based our analysis around the lithium-ion battery technology. You could try a different battery technology, different technical specifications, everything you might like to explore. So with that, I'm going to demonstrate how you can conversation by entering into our user group. Give me while I get my desktop to load up. Okay, there we go. So the starting point for engaged conversation is our website, www.homerenergy.com. If you go and mouse over to support, scroll down to community forum. You click on that, and it will take you to our Homer users group. This is an online community for the Homer hybrid optimization software, and from here you can sign in, register and sign in, and post all the different groups that we offer. The one of particular interest here is the Economics of Grid Defection group, which you find on the right-hand side of the Homer User Groups page under Groups. You click on it, it will take you to the Economics of Grid Defection discussion. Now, if you've registered on the Homer users group, you have to then register for individual groups. We set this up as a private group, but I can assure you if you register, we will approve you. Love it if you would come in and poke around a little bit and explore some of the analysis that underpins the report. Let's see. So here, under the Homer Files and Documentation section of the discussion, you can open up a Google Drive folder, theoretically, if it doesn't freeze. A Google Drive folder, and there'll be a primer here, and this gives you a bit of background of how you engage with the models. So this is your starting point. It contains a lot of critical information, understanding how to engage with the models themselves. Also, it'll give some background on the 40 different scenarios. You can download the zip file right here, the storage model zip. You will up and you'll see all 40 of the different models split by geography. So we've got the 5 different geographies, the commercial and residential. Then within each of those, we have the different types of scenarios. We've got the BC base case, the ATI, technology improvement, DSI, demand side improvement, and CI, combined improvement. Let me open one of these. So I will really open the residential base case. If I double click on this, it will load up in the Homer software. And so you'll start here with the version of our sensitivity results. If you've opened the Homer software, this will look familiar to you. And, you know, so funny, I think for this discussion, I'm going to switch it over to tabular. And there's a sensitivity cases. And each one of these lines corresponds to 1 year of the analysis. So we did an analysis for every 2 years between 2014 and 2050, 17 different years. And then a place at the bottom that corresponds to the Sunshot Department of Energy sort of target for PV, and we applied a storage target. This is all described in the report. So if you pair them together, you'll be able to follow what the sensitivities that we run. So, the primer, some great background on how you can engage with that. To do it, the key concept is that you use sensitivities to correspond to years, and for each year, there's what's known in Homer as a linked sensitivity. Now, going into depth on that is beyond the scope of a short primer here, short introduction on these models. But we have trainings that we can customize and help you to understand how to engage with the model if you want to better understand the Homer model. So once you're in here, you can modify the analysis, as already mentioned, or you could, for example, explore. So if we take, say, the 2014 case here at the top, and double-click on the simulation results, you can find all sorts of information about what was assumed, how costs are allocated, where electricity goes. You can go and see that, you know, for example, in this particular year for LA and a residential case, you have almost 6 hours of battery autonomy. There's a lot of information contained in these models that you can explore. And with that, I think I will pass it back to Dan. Except, wait, one other thing I'd like to remind you before I pass it off. You go here, down at the bottom of the discussion, we have a spot where you can post comments, and we will be monitoring this to engage in the discussion. So thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, John. So we're going to move into the Q&A period of our webinar here. So if you have a question for one of the speakers, please type chat area there on the right, and we'll queue it up for their response verbally. So So, John, first question that came in here, what's your advice for an energy investor? If utility business models are broken and capital needs to be reallocated, where should an energy investor be moving their capital to? Who would like to take that one?
Well, this is Peter Lilienthal, and that's a tricky question because there's a lot of factors that go into an investment decision. But clearly a big opportunity for distributed power moving forward, and to a large extent on regulatory reform. So a wise investor would keep a close ear to what's happening, both state PUCs and at the FERC. We think there's an enormous opportunity in the developing world where these technologies are already cost effective. And the challenge there, of course, is a marketing challenge and a logistic challenge, a business development challenge. And that's an area where we're not investors ourselves or project developers ourselves, where our goal and role in the industry is to help people navigate that world.
Yes, John Kreitz. I would add that this is clearly there is a discussion underway across the electricity sector, and it is very difficult to pick winners and losers at this point in time. But if we look historically at what's happened in similar inflection points in industries, and I think everyone likes to talk about telecom for lots of reasons, and it's in some ways it fits, and in some ways it doesn't. But the bottom line is, if you look at some of the big telecom companies, in particular AT&T, it earned a regulated return on the order of 13% up the 80s and the early 90s into deregulation. If you look at what happened after deregulation, it up to about 25% in terms of its returns, and now Verizon and AT&T are right at the about 20% level. So betting against incumbents that are aggressive and understand and try to embrace and work with the technology may not be the smartest choice. And we think there should be value that's created here. But selecting who exactly is the most aggressive from an incumbent perspective and who's going to help these devise the new business models that are going to be successful here will be a challenge here. Clearly, on the same side, picking who's going to be the winning technology providers is tougher as well, though it's likely that more, there will be more growth in that side of the market as we kind of out the new business models and these particular technologies are deployed at much larger scales even than they are today.
And Peter, next question here, real quickly, is could we have a discussion of the regulatory reforms that would be needed to facilitate this sort of grid migration you're describing here? What would be the top 3 regulatory reforms that you think should be put in place?
Well, first again, I guess, but I'd also be very interested in John Kreitz's analysis on this. One of the issues, I think, is that we have to move from a system based on kilowatt-hour sales to a nuanced system. That's one regulatory reform that's required. The utilities actually have a pretty strong disincentive related to distributed generation and energy efficiency, and to some extent that's been overcome by a variety of sort of unbundling initiatives, et cetera. But it's a more radical restructuring that's needed there to make that the utility isn't damaged financially by distributed generation, and also that allowing consumers to participate in consumers, these could be large consumers, but still, to participate in ancillary service markets in a way that where a lot of, there's been some experimentation with ancillary service markets, particularly like in PJM, et cetera, but not everywhere. And the rules are only now starting to adapt to new technologies that have different characteristics. So there's in no way do I think I have the final word on this. There's a lot of experimentation and analysis that needs to go in, and hopefully it's going to be done with less sort of political posturing, which I think was part of the problem with the California deregulation 15 years ago.
Yeah, this is not a simple question, and I think Peter made a good set of observations there. Migrating to a world where we can actually capture this value is going to require us to rethink exactly how we, where value is created and how to compensate both sides effectively, and move away from kind of the net energy metering debate, which is about a static transaction cost, and even value of solar. While it's interesting, it doesn't fully accommodate the fact that these systems are going to create different types of value at different points in the grid. And so having a fully, transactive market that allows for value to be exchanged fluidly between the kind of grid manager and the individuals who provide the different services is probably the largest and most complex reform that we need to see happen here. There are other things that are important for us to consider, like how exactly we allow interconnection in the near term and classify these different assets so as to promote their development where economic and where it's value to be created. And all different forms of regulatory options in terms of how we share the value in the end. But fundamentally, again, I think the most important reform is a focus on value and ensuring that becomes, kind of the mantra and the building block for any stable regulatory system going forward.
We've had a couple questions about application of this grid defection scenario in the developing world. One attendee asked, have you modeled any developing countries using these same style scenarios? Another attendee asked about whether this scenario can be applied to regions in South America in terms of technology and economics. So the question is, grid in sort of developing countries. What's your view on that? Peter, would you like to go first?
Thank you. And we've looked at this issue quite a lot. We've never published a report as sort of comparable to this report that we did with Rocky Mountain Institute. But we see, especially on islands that burn diesel fuel, like Hawaii, but don't have as well managed or as reliable a grid as Hawaii, a lot of customers really seriously either looking at this or having defected with just a diesel generator, their own diesel generator. So paying 50 cents a kilowatt hour, which is not uncommon around the world, actually can just with a simple diesel, up until recently at least, match that with just a diesel generator. But now using that diesel generator a lot, and it makes hybrid systems very attractive. We've done a lot of work with developing countries, probably are overdue for a similar report to this, looking at especially those developing countries that burn diesel fuel, which are mostly the smaller ones. Are in countries like India, the Dominican Republic are my two sort of poster childs, but there's lots of other countries like this, where everyone wants to run a business, even middle and upper income households that afford to backup generator, and they use it a lot. And so that's another track market.
Thanks, Peter. Attendee who submitted that question had a follow-up about how about countries in Africa like Tanzania and Kenya? What's your thought? What's your thought on that region?
Well, Kenya has an incredible solar industry that sort of sprung up completely grassroots, very, very small solar systems. Supposedly, the data is that more people in Kenya have gotten electrified through solar hybrid systems than through the utility company over the last few years. And Tanzania has a very interesting initiative to promote microgrids for rural electrification, and these are microgrids that are not grid connected. And they're two leading countries in Africa, but pretty much the entire continent is prime for the off-grid microgrids.
Thank you. What care to add to that?
I think there is covered the topic well. We at RI have been working most recently with Homer and Carbon Worm, specifically in the Caribbean. And to Peter's point, just that as a key area to understand how the clean microgrids can be deployed because they're economic today and because it's a tremendous solution for them in terms of getting out under the burden of debt and the export of their hard-earned dollars in the end right now to petroleum countries and companies. So that's a key area for application of this in the near term.
Many of these small, especially island developing countries, can spend 25% of their entire GDP on oil imports. It's an economic necessity for them.
Thank you.
One major difference, Ben, before we go on.
Sure.
So, one of the big considerations implicit in a lot of what Peter's been talking about in off-grid areas is that there's a fundamental difference between here in the U.S., where you have these utility assets, and in areas where you actually have to choose to extend the line, or you have this option when you're doing your planning. Do you extend the grid or do you build a microgrid? And so that's a fundamental distinction when you start looking at continents like Africa, where there's not an extensive grid.
Thanks. Next question, a little bit more technical in nature. Let's see. Would optimizing PV array orientation, that is the azimuth angle, help improve the demand-side load management? Does somebody care to take that, perhaps John Smart?
Cut out. What was the question?
Would optimizing PV array orientation, that is the azimuth angle, help improve the demand-side load management?
There is, of course, some benefit from changing the orientation of the PV arrays. Particularly when you get to these smaller systems, when the power is being produced, if it matches up closer to when it's being used, you can do that a little bit through PV orientation. However, the real driver for these systems is storage, as Peter discussed. If you're interested in exploring that question, it's actually a really great question to use in our software. You can do quick sensitivities on slope and azimuth and see what the impact is on operation of a microgrid system.
Thanks, John. A question here. Would community or district energy systems, say at the distribution substation level, be more economically efficient than end users building their own systems? What are your thoughts on that?
So this is John Craig. It's an important question that we have been thinking about, and there's a second companion piece to the report that we're currently in the process of working through that is really the economics of grid connection, right? Looking at how much value is created and what are the answers to some of these questions around what's the logical scale of resiliency and economics when you think about moving from individual house up to community to city to region and state level. What is the right level or optimal level to plan and create that portfolio effect that minimizes cost and ensures the operational integrity under all sorts of perturbations? So what I can say is we're working on it. What I can't say right now, to probably the chagrin of the person who asked, is what is the right answer in terms of the relative size. And so we're trying to interrogate this in our next report. I don't know how far we'll get on it because it's a very complicated question, so we may reserve that for a subsequent paper, but it certainly is at the front of our mind.
Oh, it's a great question. If gets to this whole issue of economies of scale. So the conventional technologies and the utility industry has always relied on economies of scale where the optimum scale for conventional generation is in the hundreds of megawatts. It's much smaller than that, and with storage also, or with the new storage technologies, it's much smaller than that. But it would be, as the questioner I think is implying, greater than individual household level. I think there is a huge opportunity for community scale or substation scale microgrids. It raises a regulatory one of many regulatory issues, and it varies from state to state, and it's hard to keep up on this particular topic. But in many states, there's some real regulatory issues about a microgrid that wants to serve customers. Becoming itself, is it itself a utility company? Does it need to be regulated? And is it crossing property lines? So that makes a difference, and different states deal with that differently. Is it crossing rights of way, like roadways, et cetera? These are legal issues that I'm not really the expert on, but it's just an example of the issues that arise. Whereas I think that I believe that the questioner is implying there would be some technical advantages to substation scale microgrid. Regulatory and transaction trade-offs, just like trade-offs all over the place with this analysis.
John, do you have anything to add to that, John Glassmeyer?
I think Peter and John covered it quite well. I think I'll leave it with that for now.
Thank you. Another question here. Could gas cogen or combined heat and power be added to this analysis, and would that cause an acceleration of grid defection, in your opinion?
No, I kind of implied that in very briefly in one of my slides, and combined heat and power has enormous potential, especially if gas prices stay low, and it's not renewable, it's not 100%. I mean, it's not carbon free, but it's substantially more efficient, more energy per emissions than traditional generation. It's enormous potential, but as the same regulatory issues, I think you see more combined heat and power starting to happen. It's very popular in Europe. There's an analytic challenge there because it does depend on what is the thermal load. So it's quite a different analysis, but it does look at combined heat and power, and we could do that, but it would be a whole other analysis.
I would say one of the reasons that we chose specifically to look at solar and batteries is that it is a firm fixed cost up front for long-term stability in pricing, right? Which is important when you get into natural gas. While it may be economic if you look at the systems at today's spot prices, although I would also note that today's spot price is $4.76, which is a lot higher than people thought it was going to be a year ago, right? That you have to deal with this issue of of price volatility going forward, and how exactly do you factor that in to the upfront capital that has a long tail associated with it, an operating cost? And fundamentally, if you have a storage plus solar system, you eliminate that, right? And you've essentially hedged out your risk against fuel price volatility, whereas you install something that may look economic today on a natural gas front, that volatility could come back and prove out to be uneconomic in the future, depending on what shifts in commodity prices happen going forward.
Yeah, excuse me for jumping in again. Another motivation is that what's really changed in the last few years or so is the precipitous drop in PV prices. So they dropped so precipitously that rules of thumb or intuition that we had a few years ago may not apply. And so that's where an analysis and a report like this is really useful. When the world changes that much, that quickly, on the implications of that. And storage hasn't changed quite as quickly, but there are so many new storage technologies out there. We focus on lithium ion because that's sort of the furthest along because of the industry focus on electric vehicles. But in terms of other storage technologies, not as far along, and predicting which one's going to win is really hard, but there's really starting to happen here, and that's a real good reason to do a study like this, to understand the implications of these changes that are sort of changes that are underway. And clean power, the technology isn't really changing that fast, to be honest. It's always cost effective, it's very attractive, but it's always faced regulatory obstacles.
Peter. This next question is related to that issue of storage, and the question is, have there been any PV plus battery hybrid systems in the megawatt size installed yet for commercial use or grid support to knowledge? Maybe
a lot of them under development. I mean, we were really actively involved with the Necron project. That's Sir Richard Branson's island in the Caribbean. That's a megawatt scale PV storage hybrid. There's quite a few wind diesel storage hybrids in Alaska, 26 of them to be exact. Well, not all of them use storage. But there's 26 wind diesel systems in Alaska, many of them using storage and some of them adding storage later. A lot in the approximately megawatt, or in the few hundred kilowatt size. Their King Island in Tasmania, Australia, is several megawatts. A couple in Alaska that are in the several megawatt range. And I know the Japanese are installing very large storage systems. Those are really grid-connected storage systems. So things are starting to really happen.
And I would say one of the parts of the world we haven't mentioned, Peter, is China, where there, a number of partnerships with BYD have led to very large battery-installed microgrid systems. I think they've got one that's got about a 36 megawatt microgrid with full storage capacity on it, et cetera. So they're thinking about this at a very, very large scale when you look at the types of pilots that they're putting together to try and test out the theory and use these types of hybrid solutions as a fully scalable, kind of integrated resource for the grid.
I want to add anything to that?
A lot of utilities have been looking at batteries as a way to manage the ramp rate of some of these PV systems. When you start looking at a utility scale, some of the considerations and use of storage are a little bit different than what some of the major drivers for what we had in our standalone microgrids, where the storage really is providing the compatibility for the system. So it's anyway, but yes, those sorts of systems are being deployed. And I think they're going to go, all applications of these type storage technologies are going to drive the industry forward, and hopefully lead to where the cost of storage come down and start making some of the analyses that we laid out possible.
Thank you. I've got a follow-up question on the issue of storage technologies, and this is addressed to Peter Lilienthal. Following your comments on storage technologies, could you please comment on the state of flow batteries and what you think their prospects are at the current time vis-a-vis other energy storage options?
So this is that's to extent what I had when I was talking about this flowering of storage technologies, that addition or separate from lithium ion. I like to pick winners and specific winners because there's so many choices out there, and there's so many factors that could determine whether a particular technology wins, is really successful or not. We like the fact that flow batteries have the kind of durability that's always been sort of the Achilles heel of lead-acid batteries in particular. Most of the problems that we've seen with flow batteries to date are teething problems. Frankly, the stupid kind of problems that new technologies often have of like leaky hoses and stuff that it should be easily fixable once the technology matures. Cautiously optimistic about flow batteries. I think they're very intriguing technology. There's so many different kinds. I'm optimistic that one of them will find a good niche, or at least one of them will. There are no interest to electric vehicles, but station applications, it's a completely different use. You don't really care as much about weight of them. So that's a totally satisfactory answer, but I'm cautiously optimistic that flow batteries will be an important part of the mix. Some form of flow battery, at least, will be an important part of the mix going forward.
Do you care to add to that?
No, I completely agree with Peter that there are so many innovations that are happening, not just in flow battery and Canone, kind of based chemistries, but also if you look at the organic innovations that are happening on different types of batteries. We took lithium ion as our base case because it's a knowable technology where the cost reductions can be designed in through standard, market-based innovation, and all these other technologies that are emerging. There will be some that come on that are lower cost and better suited to different applications, and that makes this whole field even more exciting because it means that, again, if you just look at lithium ion, our projections are probably conservative relative to what's going to happen in the long run, because there will be other types that come in that offer different value and different utility to advance, the storage capabilities in other ways.
What are your thoughts on batteries?
Well, I'll echo Peter's. It's a great technology, and it's a lot of development going into the storage technology space and a lot of competition. So it is very difficult to pick a winner. But I don't think counting that way is necessary. It's not going to be a winner. It's going to be winners for different value propositions that storage technologies can add. So the flow batteries, for example, in off-grid systems, there's been in the past a lot of interest in looking at them at sort of community scale, in the neighborhood of half a megawatt type system, because they're scalable and you can decouple the power and the energy design. But there's also been some looking with flow batteries towards grid support. And so, it's going to see I'm interested to see what technologies end up winning out. But I do think it's an exciting time to be, not just in the energy industry, but involved in storage. in particular.
Thanks.
I'll jump in with one more comment, which is not a completely obvious result that come out of our modeling in general, and is that for what we might call medium penetration systems, not 80%, but not 20%. I mean, there's a big range in the middle there. But you may need hours and hours of storage. You may only need 50 minutes of storage. And so that completely changes the kind of storage technology and application. So, we're kind of excited about flywheels as well, and we're thinking about necessarily storage to take noontime energy and use it in the evening, but storage to just make the system work better and allow you to turn off conventional generation and running it at really low, inefficient loads for operating reserve. Just to give you a buffer, you may only need 15 minutes of storage, could have huge amounts of value, and to get beyond the initial sort of constraint on penetration. Not get you all the way to 80%, but let's walk before we run.
That's right. This next question is related to that in terms of trying to look at the proper role of storage going forward. And the question is, can energy storage be considered a separate source in an economic dispatch / unit commitment, or just as a stabilizer / grid support for a hybrid system? What are your thoughts on that?
Absolutely, it should be. The only caveat to that would be I do know some flywheel systems that have less than a minute of storage, and that's just a stabilizer. That's not. But once you get to 15 minutes, then it absolutely should be considered that way.
It's a key where the amount of storage that we add to the system through distributed sources can have a dramatic impact on the function of the overall system. And I think eventually we need to move to a point where they are fully dispatchable resources rather than just stabilizers. And that is going to make the electricity system function in a very different way than it has historically, because the system has been governed by the fact that you need to balance supply and demand instantaneously on any given moment. And that's allowed investments in assets that really operate less than 1% of the time but still earn their cost of capital because of the way that things work out. If you have batteries being deployed when there's excess on the grid or there's the opportunity to put more on the grid, they actually eliminate that need for a wide range of assets to provide instantaneous balancing and can do that on its own, that is fundamentally a game changer and pushes electricity to look a lot more like the other capital-intensive, commodity-based industries in the world rather than a special exception that has this instantaneous time balancing requirement that really skews how it's regulated and how it's driven.
Right. Related to the issue of storage again, is this notion of some companies, such as 7-Eleven, for example, using distributed storage to significantly avoid paying high demand charges. Do you think most C&I customers will opt for this kind of storage application rather than leaving the grid altogether? So if demand charges were factored into the modeling that you did, but what do you think was the scenario there?
Go ahead, Peter.
Sorry. Interesting analytic question, because it really depends on how peaky their load is, depends on the specific rate structure, and it depends on the durability of storage technology. So with lead batteries, it's kind of hard to make that work because they have such a poor cycle life. Other times we've looked at it, not demand charge so much, but the time of use rate, the super peak rates in California look attractive until you realize that you get 100 cycles a year out of your batteries, and so there's just a lot of trade-offs in that analysis. I think there is some potential there. It's a management issue of when to ditch the batteries. Potential there. It needs to be analyzed on a really case-by-case basis, though.
I'd like to add something to that. So one of the real challenges with it is, sort of, I like this predicting the future. If you choose to curtail the demand at a particular point to save your demand charges, you need to be confident that you won't you'll not increase that demand later in the month and have to cycle your more, or not effectively have made a poor choice. If you make one wrong decision in the course of a month, you'll have incurred the demand charge despite having charged your battery. And in addition, from a regulatory perspective, a lot of the utilities include what are known as ratchet charges, where most of what you did in that month is sort of a lag. So either the previous time last year in the same month or the previous year, it'll be your demand charge will be locked up due to these ratchet mechanisms in their structures. So it is still I think exciting potential, but when you're doing analysis, I really think you want to bookend it between sort of being high uncertainty about what you'll do in the future and then perfect knowledge of the future, and engage a risk decision there about whether peaking is an appropriate technology for your particular location with your technology.
Doctor, could you like to add to that?
No, I think everything's been covered there. So,
well, thank you very much. This next question is kind of related to that in the sense of possible regulatory climates. Companies who defect from the grid, as it were, won't still look to the grid as a backup option in case of system failure. And in that scenario, won't utilities be charging some kind of service fee that will impact the business model for defection, if not blunt it entirely? What's your thoughts on that? Sort of, I guess, perhaps more of a regulatory question.
This is an area where, when we look at the cost of achieving the 98% solution versus achieving the 100% solution, it makes a lot of economic sense if a utility can reasonably pay for customers in the end not to defect, but to take the majority of their power consumption into their own hands, but still be dependent on the grid for part of their support under peak load requirements, et cetera. And the utility should be able to meet that economically because it manages across the portfolio. Whether or not the math works out in the end, and utilities do that reasonably and accordingly and don't stimulate full defection, will be a source of ongoing debate and discussion, right? And I think the important theme is that the prospect of defection empowers the customer tremendously to engage directly with the utility on exactly these types of rate and pricing issues, so that there is a real and constructive dialogue around how charges could and should be allocated, right? And that's critical. And I'm quick to say there's a big difference between hitting that economic parity point and actual defection. But at the same time, because customers will be substantially empowered when they can economically self-provide, the utilities need to come up with solutions that honor that and that reasonably apply those costs and don't have punitive ratchet charges or other things that in the end stimulate the defection that is in their interest and probably isn't economically in the interest of the potential defector as well.
Yeah, this is an important question. The the past, when defection wasn't even on the table, was not even close to cost effective, standby charges were an effective way to discourage any kind of distributed generation. But in the future, if grid is close to economic, or in the future, this could flip where high standby charges actually encourage grid defection. Now, the grid connection has a lot of value to a user, so there is value to that standby charge. I felt like, I remember exactly how the question was worded. It felt like I'd flip it around a little bit and think utilities have to be really careful not to charge too high a standby charge because it could encourage grid defection. But again, one of those regulatory issues that I referred to that's so critical moving forward.
Thank you. Time to draw this Q&A discussion session to a close. So what I'd like to do is just give each panelist a minute or so for some closing comments. Dr. Kreitz, would you like to go first?
Sure. I think what we are right now is on the cusp of a very large transition in our electricity supply system. And clearly we need to make substantial changes here. This is just one of many trends that are suggesting that we need to migrate to an alternative system where, again, value serves as the focal point, and that the grid increasingly needs to allow the transfer and the transaction around that value between many consumers and many producers who will shift their roles on a day-to-day, week-to-week basis. And it's an exciting time for investors. It's an exciting time for customers and potential would-be providers. But it does require us to shift at a pace that, frankly, our regulatory structures haven't been used to operating at historically. And if we're unable to do that, if we're unable to move from a 2 to 3 year rate case cycle to a 6-month rate case cycle, that's more adaptive, we do risk breaking the system because these technologies will move faster right now than our current infrastructure and our current policy and supportive governing processes are capable of managing. So the key that I would say is we need to act now in order to ensure that everyone shares in the new value that's created going forward.
Thank you, Dykes. John Glassmeyer, would you like to offer your closing comments?
Yeah. So one of the key things that's implicit in what John Kreitz was just speaking about is that there'll need to be a lot of dialogue. So I'd like to sort of reemphasize the fact that we've sort of put a stake in the ground and thrown something out there for discussion. The economic grid defection report. In support of that, we've opened up all of our analytics and modeling for people to build upon it and engage in the dialogue. And I would encourage everyone who's been on this webinar to get into that dialogue and help us move towards overcome some of the obstacles that are looming on the horizon in terms of all of these issues related to distributed generation, centralized utilities, regulation, to move that forward.
Dr. Lindahl, any closing thoughts?
Yeah, I want to reinforce John Kreitz's point about the pace of change has accelerated in a completely unprecedented way, and its impact on the utility industry is unprecedented. And we're talking about PV technology and storage, even more about storage technology. We haven't talked about information and control technology and power electronics. And this huge backlog of information and control technology that's been applied in other industries that is only starting to be applied in the utility industry. There's kinds of really legitimate reasons why the utility industry is but a real challenge moving forward. There is, as John mentioned, a danger if it can't adapt fast enough. One of the things that worries me the most is the impact that posturing can have on getting to the right result. And so we're already seeing that where players are influencing the debate, and it's understandable that everybody's trying to get their advantage for themselves, but the role of the rater should be to sort through all that, and it's difficult to do, and it's wisdom if it isn't driven by good analysis and instead driven by whoever can squawk the loudest. Finally, we think the world needs to pay a lot more attention to what's happening in sort of obscure places where there really are experimenting with renewables at much higher penetrations. And there's smaller places. There's differences, but there's a huge amount of really important going on in places, Alaska and Australia, and starting to happen in a lot more places about manage utility systems with using load management and storage to manage high penetrations of renewables. That's our focus, and we think the world needs to pay more attention to that sector. Challenges, of course, is that these solutions tend to be a little bit site-specific, but there's still a lot of learning that everyone could benefit from. Thank everybody for hanging in there. I guess we went over time, but I've really enjoyed it, and thank you for hosting it for us.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you again to all our panelists who participated in today's webinar. Just as an administrative note, a recording of this webinar, including both PowerPoint and audio, will be available to registered attendees shortly after today's session. Also, we will send out the PDF of this presentation, so you'll have that as well. And we will send a link where you can view the recording in on-demand format once it's available. If you have further questions for our panelists, feel free to send them to microgridnews.com, and we'll be happy to have the speakers follow up with you directly. On behalf of the Rocky Mountain Institute and Homer Energy, I'd like to thank you all for attending, and we look forward to your participation in future such webinars. If your company is interested in suggesting a topic for a future webinar, please feel free to contact us. And we look forward to staying in touch, answering any additional questions you may have. So thanks again, and we're signing off now. Thanks.